We shall not pay the price of power and of influence and of a simple game of this power for the price of human life. And this is exactly what the proposition theme stands for today. For the fact that the whole principles of the United Nations, keeping peace, protecting life, are actually undermined by the veto. And for these reasons, we think that these nations of the Security Council right now should no longer have them. But first, before going into my arguments, I would like to clarify what we're talking about today. So we know that the Security Council is one of the organisms of the United Nations that, of course, as we know, is dealing with the security. We know that in this very moment, it is comprised of 15 countries, 5 permanent members. United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. And another 10 non-permanent members that are switching alternatively. We know that in this very moment, the 5 permanent members have the right to veto, they have the right to say no, they have the right to stop every single resolution from happening. We know that this far, the United States and Russia have given the greatest number of vetoes, respectively 160 for the United States and 170 for Russia. Our model today is the fact that we're going to take away the veto and we're going to impose majority. So we think that we're going to keep the permanent 5, keep the 10 non-permanent, everything is going to go exactly like before, simply the fact that for a decision to be made, we're going to need a majority, we're going to need like 8 votes of 15, so we think that this is going to work. Now, in my speech, I'm going to talk on 3 main points. Firstly, I shall talk to you about the first argument, vetoing for individual interest. Secondly, I shall talk about perpetuating power and how we think that this veto is a method for these 5 permanent members of the Security Council to express their power of their influence. And thirdly, the second speaker shall talk to you about a consensus for peace. Now, firstly, let's look at our first argument, vetoing for individual interest. So we have told you that the whole purpose of the United Nations was keeping the peace and protecting life. What we see from the facts and from everything that happened ever since the United Nations was created, we know that it is the reverse. And we know that because of the interest of the superpowers, people have died and peace couldn't be kept because of the fact that the veto keeps blocking some resolutions that were supposed to protect life. So today we're going to give you some examples, and the first one is the Rwanda genocide, 1994. We know that in that very moment there were 2 tribes that were fighting, the Hutu and the Tutsi. In that moment, France was supporting the Hutu, US was supporting the Tutsi, so therefore when the United Nations wanted to intervene to protect life and to stop the genocide, well, the France and US had said no, had vetoed, therefore 800,000 people died in that genocide. So we think that this hindered the purpose of the United Nations. Second example, we have Iraq, which we know that it wasn't at the moment wasn't an oppressive regime. But we know that a resolution that could have allowed a peacekeeping intervention was vetoed. Therefore, the US had the possibility of entering there and getting the oil, which already happened. Now, third example, we now have Syria. So we know that in this very moment, for more than 1 year in the Arab Spring, the people in Syria are protesting against their regime. So we know that the United Nations is trying to help and protect those people that are that are protesting for their rights. Well, Russia and China keep vetoing that and keep forgetting, and therefore the death toll is rising day by day. More people die day by day, and bad things still happen. Moreover, we see the fact that there were some situations where they didn't even propose a resolution because they already knew that there was going to be a veto. They already knew that countries would say no. So here we have the example of the Kosovo genocide. because nothing happened, because they knew that Russia was going to support Serbia because of the same ideological views. So in that very moment, the thing is that nothing happened and the people still died. So we know that the only thing and the only message that they transmitted is that life is not important to them. Go.
How exactly does side proposition psychically know that these motions were not introduced because of the veto power?
Okay, I don't actually understand your point, but we know the fact that the resolutions that the UN makes is in order to protect peace, is in order to protect life, is in order to keep the security. So we actually see that when there is a resolution that tries to keep this thing and tries to save lives, there are countries that say no and that impede this thing. And we know that this is very bad because it doesn't keep it efficient, because it undermines the whole purpose of the United Nations. Now, secondly, I'm going to pass on to the second argument about perpetrating power. So we know that the veto, therefore, is a slow method of these countries of getting more and more power. So we see that the US definitely has an interest in Israel, and the US is protecting Israel continuously. So when Israel started extending, and the United Nations tried to make a resolution in order to stop that, the US protected Israel because of its interest, because it wanted oil, because its interest is more important than the interest of the world as a whole. We also see that Russia and China keep protecting dictatorships and keep protecting regimes that are close to them. They do not allow any intervention in the Middle East in order to protect people. So we see that in this very moment, Russia and China cling to power, cling to their spheres of influence. So therefore, we see that every power of this Security Council is protecting their interests rather than thinking about the interests of the other. Well, by our model, by imposing this majority, we know that that will not happen anymore, because right now it is 1 against 14. But therefore, after that, it will be 14 against 1. So we know that this is what should matter, because the interest of one power should not matter over the interest of the other members of the Security Council, because they have the same power, and because of the fact that we think that this is oppressive. So in the end, because of the fact that we have proven you exactly why the UN Security Council is rather inefficient, because it doesn't actually protect the purposes of the United Nations as a whole, because they let people die, because they care more about money, about oil, about their own interests, rather than making what is supposed to be, rather than taking responsibility of being in the Security Council and actually protecting life, because this is a great measure of perpetrating their power, of actually getting more power day by day because of their influences. We think that in the end, this should not happen anymore. We shouldn't have veto anymore.
Call upon the first member of opposition.
This evening, a side opposition stand before you today, trying to promote, withhold, and foster the basic goals and principles of the United Nations. Here stands before you an opposition that believes that veto nations are entitled to their veto power and are imperative in upholding the best interests of UN member states. Yet here stands before you a proposition trying to convince you that every single member of the United Nations Security Council that has the right to veto power does not actually deserve these rights. And on opposition, we would like to emphasize the key words, every single nation. Here stands before you an idealistic proposition that is trying to tell you that all nations should be able to equally vote on issues with pertinence to security, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The resolution before the House is already introduced to you today by the proposition is this House believes that all UN member nations, that has already been introduced to you by the proposition. Myself as the leader of opposition and my partner, the deputy leader of opposition and the opposition whip will prove to you today exactly why we are truly proud to oppose the motion before the House. Here on side opposition, we feel that we have some things that we must prove to you. The first being that veto power are actually in line and fundamental with the principles of the United Nations. And today, I will be proving that burden to you today. And my colleague, the deputy leader of the opposition, will continue on to prove to you how many nations that are the veto powers have the fundamental right to maintain their respective positions. Yet we also feel that side proposition must prove some things to you today, which they haven't actually proven to you today on their side of the House. We feel that they must prove to you that every single nation that uses their veto power uses it in a way that directly contradicts the goals of the United Nations. We also feel that they must prove to you today that the historical and claimed that these veto nations have will actually not be detrimental to the other states. Today, as the leader of the opposition, I will be speaking to you about the basic purpose of veto power and the effects of abolishing veto power. And the second opposition will go on to speak to you about the fundamental rights of veto nations to their veto powers. But ladies and gentlemen, before getting into my constructive case today, let me do some refutation as to what we've seen on behalf of side proposition. The first thing that they said on side proposition was this idea of implementing a majority system. Yet we have a large problem with this over on side opposition. We feel that a majority system would actually cause this idea of tyranny of the majority and would not actually protect the minority states, ladies and gentlemen.
Sir.
Not at this time, thank you. They brought forth this idea of 8 votes versus 7 votes in a vote system of 15. And we feel that if 7 nations are actually not accounted for and 7 nations' voices are not being heard, and these being some of the largest political and military, not at this time, thank you, these being some of the largest political and military contenders in the world, we see that this could actually cause a detriment to international relations. And these nations' voices are not actually being heard. Therefore, the basic principles of the United Nations are not actually being withheld in this circumstance. Not at this time, thank you. The second example that they chose to bring forth to you today was this idea of the Rwandan genocide. And what we feel with the Rwandan genocide is that, not at this time, thank you, is that it was actually largely because of the Rwandan government fighting for sovereignty. Then they brought forth this idea to you of the Kosovo genocide. And yes, we would say that in this circumstance, there was actually a misuse of veto power on behalf of Russia. But ladies and gentlemen, we feel that side proposition still has failed to prove to you the burden today, which is that every single nation that has the right to veto power should no longer have the right to veto power. And we feel that this is actually only one instance in which we've seen this veto power being misused. Ladies and gentlemen, not at this time, thank you. They also chose to bring forth this idea that all nations should have the same precedent when discussing issues over security. And over on side opposition and this side of the House today, we feel that some nations should actually have a greater precedent when discussing this issue of security. We feel that these 5 nations that are the veto powers and the rotating members of the Security Council actually have a larger political and military presence in the world and in the United Nations as a whole, and therefore should actually have that power. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'll take you in 1 second. Now, ladies and gentlemen, to move into my constructive case today, the first point that I'll be bringing forth to you today, this idea of the basic power, this idea of the basic principle of veto power. But before that, let me take this question.
We want to clarify what you want today. Do you want all countries to have veto power or only the permanent 5 to have veto power?
We're saying actually that the status quo is fine. We're saying that only those permanent 5 should have veto power. Now, we recognize that there have been some misuses of this veto power, but we feel that side proposition is still failing to prove to you that every single one of these nations should not have access to veto power. Now, back into my first point, not at this time, thank you. Now, back into my first point, the basic purpose of veto power. We feel that by implementing this bill, we would actually be preventing the tyranny of the majority, ladies and gentlemen. Because what we would say is that by abolishing veto power, not at this time, thank you, we would say that by abolishing veto power, we're actually allowing nations to gang up on one another through a majority system. We're saying that we're actually allowing some nations to vote against the will of those other nations, those large political and military contenders, leaving them actually unvoiced within the United Nations. And what we would say is that one of the basic principles of the United Nations is actually for all voices to be heard. And we would say that the veto system, not thank you. no thank you, is actually one of the methods in which all of the voices of, not at this time, thank you, are actually one of the methods in which all of the voices of these states are heard. We would also say that the veto system is actually working to promote and further the ideals of peace in the world. Because we see that the veto powers are actually preventing, not at this time, thank you, are actually preventing unnecessary outbreaks of war. And since side proposition pointed to this example of Iraq, we would like to point back to that same example, ladies and gentlemen. We saw that France actually threatened to veto this idea brought forth by the UN Security Council. And we saw that this actually largely resulted in the majority of nations not contributing to the war on terror. And we see that this was actually an extremely effective example in which veto power was used, ladies and gentlemen. Now to move on into my second argument today, this idea of the effects of abolishing veto power. And what I'm going to do is run you through a simple line of analysis, but it's a little bit long, ladies and gentlemen. But before I do that, I will take this question.
If you still talk about how we must protect all countries from veto, can you explain to us how Slovenia, for example, has so much power because US and Russia have the power to veto?
We're saying that Slovenia's voice can actually be heard within the United Nations current system. We're saying that their voice can actually be brought forth by the General Assembly, and that this is a nation that can actually be elected onto the rotating members of the Security Council. However, we feel that Slovenia is a nation that does not have enough presence to actually be part of the 5 nations who can. This time, thank you, I'm still answering your first question. We feel that this is not a nation that actually has the right to be part of those 5 principal veto nations because it does not have enough of a political or military magnitude. Now, what I was saying, back to this issue, we say that if the majority votes on a bill that is passed, minorities don't want to contribute. Let's give an example. Let's say one of the minorities that didn't want to contribute to a motion that was being passed was Britain, ladies and gentlemen. We see that this nation, Britain being the case study, would actually be forced into this anyways. And what we would say is that this would actually increase tensions between member states and would actually ruin the cohesion of the Security Council, ladies and gentlemen. And we see that this would actually ruin the united concept of the United Nations, being that all nations should be united with one another, ladies and gentlemen. For the reasons that I have brought forth to you today as the first opposition, and the reasons that the deputy opposition and opposition whip will continue to bring forth to you today in their constructive cases, I would like to thank you very much for your time. We are truly proud to oppose the motion before the House today. Thank you.
Thank you. And now here for the second member of opposition.
We believe today that using the United Nations as a masquerade to protect your own interests, as Russia, as the United States, as China, is something totally illegitimate when we're talking about the society we're living in today. And Team Opposition did not respond to that. Now, we believe that Team Opposition is clearly idealistic here. They say that you have clearly a misuse of veto and not an abuse of it. Now, this is what I'm going to prove on behalf of this House, exactly that. First of all, they abuse the veto too. My first point about vetoing for individual interest. Then I'm going to talk about how exactly they perpetuate their power and do not make an equal standpoint for every country. And then I'm going to talk about consensus for peace and how exactly giving a clear and equal vote for each and every member of the Security Council is a step forward for consensus for peace and actually making the United Nations have their goal achieved. But first of all, let's look a little bit at what Team Opposition brought today on the table. Now, first of all, we want to point out that they didn't quite rebuttal our points brought them to in front of the House. But first of all, let's look exactly at the first point about tyranny of majority. Because they clearly don't understand how the United Nations Security Council actually works. Because nowadays, there is no such thing as tyranny of the majority, okay? But the tyranny of the permanent 5, or the tyranny of the one that uses the veto. So, out of 15 countries that we have today, we actually, even if you present the voice of every 15, only the voice of one that chooses to veto is actually heard. Now, also, we believe that they brought up this point that you will cause unnecessary war. But we believe exactly that, yes, it is a necessary war because people believe today that actually holding a war between the permanent 5 powers or whatever they want to prove today is not something that people in the specific countries actually want, which I'm going to explain further on in my argument. Also, they brought the point that there will be no more cohesion in the United Nations, which we believe that is actually logically flawed. Because we see exactly that when you have more consensus, you have majority, or you have people abstaining from voting, which count as exactly a vote of okay, is exactly when you have this more consensus and more cohesion in actually deciding to intervene somewhere. Now, they clearly did not respond to our examples brought forward by my first speaker of not only Rwanda, but also Iraq, but also Syria, but also Georgia, and so on, that I'm going to further explain to you in exactly how it was an abuse of power. Now, let's move on to my points of the case. Now, let's look first at vetoing for individual interests. Because we told you exactly, both team agreed that the purpose of the United Nations is to keep peace in the world, which they clearly fail in today's society. Now, let's look exactly at what happened in Rwanda, because they said that, look, it was a misuse of veto. Yes, it was a misuse of veto. It was an abuse of France and the United States to protect their sphere of interest, to protect their own interest in fighting each other on a different international stage, which was Rwanda. And exactly that happened. 800,000 people died, and Team Opposition does not have a problem with that, while Team Proposition does. Second of all, we see exactly, no, thank you, sir. We see exactly that in Iraq, they said that, look, they don't want other countries to join the war on terror. But we don't believe it's like that. We see exactly that you have a systematic veto in a lot of cases when we're talking about Israel. Israel that wants to expand in Palestine, to create settlements, to take their land and further the conflict. When the United Nations Security Council wanted to intervene, the United States vetoed that in order to protect their economic and political interests in that specific sphere. No, thank you, sir. Also, we told you about Syria, that the United Nations is trying to help Syria over and over again. They had the third veto of China and Russia a few weeks ago. Now, we believe exactly that because you're letting people die, you are not fighting for peace. You are fighting exactly these permanent 5 countries, which are the most influent there. They are using this influence in order to gain more power. Also, let's look exactly at what happened in Russia with Georgia. When South Ossetia and Abkhazia fought there, Russia vetoed the intervention of the United Nations in order for them just to intervene in Ossetia and fight the people there, because it was easier. Now, we believe exactly that if they had sent troops there, it would have been it would have been harder for them to actually fight against the entire United Nations Security Council that actually would have intervened in South Ossetia to stop people from dying. And Team Opposition needs to prove that that wouldn't be so. Also, let's look exactly that they tell us, how do we know about these resolutions that haven't been put forward in the United Nations Security Council, that we believe is because of the deterrent of veto, that nothing will actually happen. First of all, because you have General Assembly, you discuss there the problems of today's world, and then talk about if you're going to lead it further to the United Security Council. And they didn't do that. And also we see that this is exactly the sphere where the United Nations actually acts, in keeping peace. Now we see that in Kosovo they didn't do so. We see that a lot of places they did not intervene, they didn't even discuss about it because the Permanent 5 is controlling the United Nations Security Council, and we believe that Team Opposition needs to prove that it isn't so. Second of all, we believe that they're perpetuating power because, as we see, when we're talking about China and Russia selling weapons to autocratic regimes, they want to keep their influence in certain regions. As I've told you, Russia and China with autocratic regimes, the United States with countries in the Middle East in order to gain more economic power, to exploiting oil with contracts between their government and the other government, and so on. Now we believe that through this, you gain more influence for these countries, and you do not make an equal standpoint in military power and political power for the rest of the countries that actually are in the United Nations. Now these things makes them perpetuate their power for the future. In the long term, you're going to have the same powers in the world, and the other little countries that will be abused through their resolutions. Now, we also believe that when you have 14 countries versus 1, because they all have an equal standpoint in the United Nations Security Council, we make it, first of all, more democratic, and second of all, faster, because they intervene faster in taking decisions. Now, this leads me to my third argument about consensus for peace. Now, we already told you that we believe that the United Nations is a masquerade in order to protect the interests of the United Nations Permanent Five. Now, I believe that there would be no veto. The other countries will present an opposition for the Permanent Five. There will be these checks and balances between these countries in order for them not to become abusive. Now, we believe that first of all, the countries in the United Nations Security Council will start to think about intervening more. And we believe that intervening more is exactly leading to making the steps to actually creating this global peace that we're talking about. Now, we need to think about interventions that now cannot be brought forward because they will be vetoed, like intervening in North Korea for the autocratic regime, like intervening in Venezuela, where President Hugo Chavez is in office for more than 20 years, with, again, a very oppressive regime. Now, we believe that you should intervene here, but you cannot bring them now on the table because there is the deterrent that it will be vetoed. The United Nations now is clearly in a standby. We need to unlock it, we need to take it further. Now, we told you that you cannot do that unless you have an equal standpoint for each and every country in the United Nations Security Council. We don't care about what happened in history, we don't care about their power today, we care about peace, we care about voting for a proposition here.
The second member of opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, honorable judges, and worthy opponents, I'm going to skip the fancy intros because I have a lot to get through. But what I'd like to say for you is that as the deputy leader of the opposition, it's going to be my job for you to do two things. The first thing I'm going to do for you is to review some of the more obvious fallacies inside Proposition's case, and then I'm going to further our case by talking about the fundamental rights of veto nations to their veto powers. So, to begin, I'd like to do rebuttal through two major issues of clash in which I'd see. The first one is this issue of the majority versus the tyranny of the veto, as they called it. And then the second one would be the idea of countries using their veto power to further their own personal agendas, and this issue of equality. So to move on to my first point of clash, the issue of the majority and the issue of the veto. So what we'd say is that they're essentially posing a tyranny of the majority through this voting process. Because what we'd say is that a United Nations Security Council vote is a binding bill. And so what we'd say by that is if a majority of the nations agree upon something, this would bind a nation that disagrees in this minority to do something they may not want to do. And we see that that is inherently problematic, as the leader of the opposite brought up in his example with the case study of Great Britain. Essentially, if a majority of these nations, no thank you, would agree that Great Britain must support something and would agree that Great Britain must provide troops to something, and Great Britain doesn't agree to this, we would see that this is inherently problematic. Then they talked about this idea of tyranny of the veto. The fact that that currently in the status quo, the veto is creating a tyranny of these nations because all of a sudden these 14 votes don't mean nothing if one person vetoes. But what we'd say to that, ladies and gentlemen, is there an inherent difference between when a country vetoes something and when a law is passed under this tyranny of the majority they're proposing. What we'd say, ladies and gentlemen, is that in a veto, what's happening is they're stopping a bill from going through. They're stopping something that they don't like from happening, as opposed to them being forced into something that isn't happening to happen. And we'd say that that difference equates to the fact that the veto is less detrimental to the United Nations society rather than this tyranny of the majority. Next, I'd like to talk about this idea of them saying that what we're saying is that it's legitimate for nations to further their own personal agendas through this use of the veto. They brought up the case study of, say, Russia and Kosovo. And what we'd say, ladies and gentlemen, is what is wrong with that? We'd say that the goal of these nations is to represent their views and their ideas in the United Nations. And if they believe something, we would ask side proposition what makes them the authoritarian force as to say what this country is allowed to view, what this country is allowed to believe, and what this country is allowed to vote on. Wouldn't you agree?
So you're actually saying that you let these countries have their interests while thousands of people die because of their interests?
Well, what we'd say is that these countries' right to their own opinion is very important. And what we'd say is that if there are thousands of people dying because of these views, we would say that that is a bad thing, in fact. But what we'd say is that this isn't the case in the vast majority of times. They brought up one or two case studies, but what we'd say is in the majority of cases in the United Nations, a vote or a veto is implemented because a nation is not willing to be forced into certain actions. So next, the idea of equality. They brought up this idea that not every nation in the United Nations should be equal and they should have an equal say. And what we'd say that this isn't the case, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that there are nations who should have a larger say in matters than others. Because what we'd say, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that if a nation like Great Britain or if a nation like France is supporting millions of dollars to a certain project or billions of dollars and large amounts of peacekeepers, they should have a greater say than a country who perhaps isn't even involved in this certain conflict. And what we'd say is that these nations should have a greater say over the issues in which they are heavily involved in. And so what I'd like to end my rebuttal with is two questions in which I believe that the side proposition must answer in order for them to further come back in this clash. And these are questions that we believe are the crux as to why they might have a possibility of winning the debate if they were to answer them. So the first question would be, why do all countries lose their right to veto due to the actions of certain countries? And the second question would be, why are they the total authority as to what countries are allowed to or not allowed to believe? So I'd now like to move into my constructive. And essentially the burden I'd like to prove on our side of the house is that some nations do deserve this right to veto. So aptly named, it's called Why These Nations Deserve the Right to Veto. So what we would say is the number one initial idea to as why we believe that the Big Five have these veto powers is the inherent benefits they bring. But I personally believe that my colleague Jade has already discussed these, that my colleague Jade has already talked about the benefits and the harms in which vetoes or not vetoes would bring. So I would like to start by saying why initially these nations had this power. So initially, we believe that the reason as to why this Big Five received this veto power was because they would be the major factors, or they were the major factors in the creation of the United Nations after World War II. And we would say that this creation led to what we'd see as the longest lasting series of post-Cold War peace, and that because of this, we would believe that these nations' contribution to the inception of this body leads to them having a larger say. But furthermore, we wouldn't like to just look at the past. We'd like to look at the current situation of the world. So currently, we would believe that upon the founding role of the United Nations, after the founding of the United Nations in modern day society, we would see that right now the Big Five contribute some of the most in terms of peacekeeping forces, some of the most in terms of aid, and some of the most in terms of monetary contributions to the United Nations Security Council. And as of this, as I already touched on in my rebuttal, they do deserve this larger say because they have the most contributions going towards these missions. They should therefore have the most say, and as well as the fact that they should have the say when these contributions shouldn't go to. I'll take one.
This is factually incorrect. Most of the peacekeeping troops now that are being used are offered by African countries who are by African countries mostly.
Well, what we believe is that assertion made isn't necessarily true, but if it were, we'd like to hear more analysis as to why this is true and more factual evidence brought up later in the reply speech. So, ladies and gentlemen, what have I told you today? I've explained to you why the tyranny of the majority is more detrimental than their proposed tyranny of the veto. Because the tyranny of the majority proposes a system in which countries are forced into something they don't want to do, rather than simply saying that something shouldn't happen because they don't want to do it. Secondly, I've told you that there is nobody who should be allowed to tell a country what they're allowed to believe, what their stance on an issue should be, and therefore it is legit for them to further an agenda in which they might have through this veto. And finally, I've told you that nations shouldn't be equal because certain nations contribute more than others and therefore should have a stronger say in the issues in which they can contribute. Then, in my constructive case, I told you that these nations, with their veto powers, do deserve their veto powers, both because historically they were the founding members and historically they brought together this United Nations society, and because currently they're contributing a large amount of support and currently they're giving towards this cause. So I'd like to end this once again by restating what we believe 5 Proposition needs to do. They need to tell us why all nations lose out because of the actions of few, and they need to tell us why they are the total authority on what a nation can believe. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call upon the third member of the affirmative side.
We say it's past time that big powers stop simply dividing the world based on their own interest and start actually doing what's right and allow the UN to do what's right for the entire earth. And today this motion is pretty simple. It's about which world is better when we have 2 systems in which the Security Council would work. The first system is a system in which the permanent members would have veto power. The second system is a system proposed today by the government, by us, in which all actions by the Security Council of UN peacekeeping troops will simply be decided by a majority of all members, both permanent and non-permanent. And thus I'm going to have 3 major points with which I'm going to end the constructing of my team. First of all, about majority abuse versus veto abuse. Second of all, about stopping personal interest to interfere. Third of all, about the future of UN. Now about majority abuse versus veto abuse. Because their only argumentation was like, oh, but the moment we're going to have majority abuse, more bills will be passed. It means that the majority of the countries in the Security Council will abuse the minority and they will make them do things, whilst in our case, when you have veto, at least the Security Council doesn't do anything, so we don't make people do anything. Let's start with a very simple clarification. The UN Security Council does not make people do something. It simply controls things that the UN do. AKA it controls UN peacekeeping troops. It does not control, let's say, Great Britain's troops or US troops or anything. It simply controls UN peacekeeping troops that can be that are offered voluntarily. It cannot say, US, give me some more troops. No. UN has as many troops as they are offered voluntarily by certain countries, and it can also control certain economic sanctions of the UN. So we do not make people do anything. So their whole point simply false. Even more, we don't say that. We don't say that Great Britain or US or any other permanent members should have more of a say in this situation because they would do more of the job. In fact, most of the peacekeeping troops that are currently operative are being given by countries from Africa like Morocco, Kenya, mostly because most of the countries and conflicts in which UN has intervened are now in Africa. And let's say Kenya would really like for things to stop and for fightings to stop in neighbor Rwanda, because then there wouldn't be any spillovers, etc., etc., etc. It's more than obvious. And because of that, we say that there is no majority abuse. Or if there is a majority abuse, it would be anyway in their situation. The big abuse is that when you stop something from happening, when you stop UN from doing its actual jobs, then you have a tyranny of the US over countries like small Rwanda that has to suffer a genocide simply because US wants, simply because it's not in the interest of the US for that genocide to be stopped. This is true tyranny. We're not abusing anyone. Even more, in their system even in their system, if a bill would be passed, anyway the majority would be abused. Anyway, most of the countries in the United Nations General Assembly do not have a say. Most countries do not have a say. Only the countries that in the Security Council have a say. So anyway, their whole point does not stand. Because UN is not about allowing each country to do everything it wants. No, the UN is about stopping conflicts, making peace. And this is my second point about how we're actually gonna stop little desires of big countries to interfere with stopping peace. Because it told us that, oh, but big countries have the right to say their own opinion and to do all this kind of things. And we're like, yes, okay. It's more than okay for US to say that, yes, I do not want for the Rwandan genocide to be stopped, but we do not say that US can simply stop it can stop all UN actions just because it said so. We do not say that U.S. interest should be greater than, I don't know, Brazil's interest in any way on the international scene. Because the only method for us to achieve peace is by listening to to the interests of all countries, because cumulated, the interests of all countries result only in a general interest for peace. And thus, we believe that this is the only way for us to stop this. And we have provided you extensive analysis how the veto was used exactly to create war. We say that in places that many vetoes have been used simply abusively. We can take systematic vetoes like the one that U.S. has given in any resolution regarding Israel, in which the UN could have stopped Israel for simply to build settlements in Palestinian territory. It could have stopped Israel abuse over Palestinians. Simply, U.S. has vetoed that. It has created a situation of conflict there simply because it wanted so. Russia, I'll take you in a second, sir. Russia has vetoed a resolution that would have made it fight UN peacekeeping troops in Georgia, more exactly in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, simply because it wanted to have an easier fight there, because it wanted to simply keep control there and have absolutely no one say that it is so obvious that what you're doing is wrong. Yes, sir.
Do you recognize that Palestine actually initiated the hostilities that eventually led to the Israeli invasion of Palestine?
Do you realize that Palestinians do not have a place in which to live? They cannot make any trade because Israel is blocking any trade. You realize that Israel is currently breaking international laws that say that you cannot simply build settlements on disputed territory. This is a situation at fact. At the moment, they will not have the power to simply veto everything. In that moment, the UN can simply do its job and say, look, Russia, if you go with tanks in Georgia, we come after you with tanks, with bombers, with all this. And the issue is that Russia may be very willing to fight a couple of Georgian soldiers, but it wouldn't want to fight the entire power of the UN. AKA, Russia would not do anything in Georgia. At the same time, Israel would stop building settlements. At the same time, we would intervene in Rwanda. We would intervene in Syria and stop the killing there. We would finally create peace. And this brings me to my last point about the future of UN. Because it told us because we believe that the moment we start intervening more, that moment we're gonna actually see the benefits of intervening. We're gonna see the benefits of peace. Second of all, we're gonna create true precedents of us and intervening someone. As a whole, in future, in 20, 30 years, we're going to create more of a consensus that UN should have a bigger role. It shouldn't simply let abuse slip by its watchful eye, and would start actually doing something. And thus, because this international consensus will be formed, then big powers that would want to step over this international consensus would be even more taxed by the international community. Thus, they'll have an even more incentive to stop doing that. They will stop simply perpetuating their power through the use of the UN Security Council. And as a whole, we're going to have a better world. So thus, I'm going to ask you one simple question. What's the use of veto? And we're waiting for a response from team opposition.
I call on the third member of opposition.
You guys ready? Right. As the third speaker for opposition, I'm actually going to skip the introduction fluff like my partner because I feel like there's a lot that I need to get to, and I think it's absolutely important that I do get to all the fallacies that were presented by side proposition on this debate today. And so what I'm going to do for you guys today is I'm going to try and deduce this debate into three key themes. The first being the rights of nations and why certain nations get to choose to do certain things. The second being what is in the interest, or the best interest of promoting world peace and doing what is best for the world community at large. And the third being whether or not these nations who have the veto power at this current time deserve the veto power that they do have today. So I'd like to get started with the first theme. But first, I'm going to answer the question posed by the first speaker, or the third speaker of opposite proposition, about what is the use of veto power. Because apparently he hasn't been listening to our entire speech. But if you check your flow, you'll find it, you'll see it, and it's quite clear. So if you want to answer that question, I can't actually get into it. But again, I beg you, please check your flow. You'll find plenty of very valid reasoning within it. So moving into my first theme, the rights of nations, and whether and why exactly the veto power exists. So what we brought up was this idea that the veto power prevents nations from being forced into acting in the way that they would rather not act.
Sir.
Thank you. What we would say is that this allows people, and this also allows small nations to be represented by larger nations with veto powers in order to protect them. So what we brought up in response to our point about the primary reasons for the veto power is this idea of the Slovenia, or was the Slovenia POI, in which they asked, how does Russia having a PO or a veto actually give Slovenia greater power? Or how does this give any nation that doesn't have a veto power greater power? And we'd like to explain that when this nation, or when a nation has the veto power, it's actually capable of supporting that nation and preventing other nations from bullying it. Yes, thank you. So the next thing they brought up is that the UN doesn't actually make people do anything, and then it never actually makes its members do anything, which is simply ridiculous, because all nations contribute to the United Nations, and what the United Nations Security Council decides is where they put those resources and those troops and that money that all these nations decide to contribute. And the people who are largely contributing money and troops to the United Nations are large nations like the United States, like Great Britain, and like China, like Russia, and like France. And what we'd say is that these nations, as a result, do deserve to say where their resources go. The next thing they brought up is this idea in their model in which we'd simply take the veto away and simply, no thank you, rely on simply having a majority. And what we would say is that this leads directly to the tyranny of the majority. And this leads to countries being able to gain up on other smaller nations. What we would say is that if countries have a veto, they can support smaller nations. That countries that have a veto support smaller nations and prevent countries from gaining up on them. What we would say is that there are two sides to every story, and that the nations that prevent vetoes, that prevent action against nations through vetoes that would otherwise be unpopular, what we would say is that they are telling the side of the story of these nations that can't represent themselves, and what they're doing is trying to represent this nation who can't actually do it for themselves. No, thank you. The next thing they brought up was the idea that vetoes spread power and influence, and this idea that because these nations are actually using the veto to strong-arm their way into using, or to acting in their own interests. What I would say is that, and so they brought up a couple key examples. The first being this idea that Israel, or that the U.S. is blocking action against Israel, who is actively moving into Palestinian territory. What I would say is that what actually happened in Israel was that Palestine initiated an attack against Israel, and that the actions taken by Israel were things that were preventing themselves when they were in a state of war with Palestine. What I would say is that Palestine committed an act of war against Israel, no thank you, and as a result, Israel responded in order to protect itself. First of all, we don't think this is the business of the United Nations to intervene in this case, because it's simply the case that Israel is protecting itself, and next we're saying that it's not actually a negative thing to do for the United States to assure that they can do this. The next thing they said was that Russia and China protect dictatorships. And what we would say is that they, again, represent countries that cannot represent themselves. So the second main theme that I'd like to get into is this idea of what is the interest of peace. Thank you. What is in the best interest of assuring peace? So what we spoke to is this idea of what the elimination of the veto would do and how it would lead to less cohesion in the United Nations. What I'd say is that, and what they brought up in response to this, is that somehow consensus equals cohesion. That somehow, because everybody's voting on something, everybody's going to somehow agree with it. What we would say is that it's very obvious that if Great Britain is forced to do something or take action that it does not agree with, it's not going to support that, and it very might well decline to support this. What we would say is that if nations aren't acting in a united way, it's completely defeating the purpose of the United Nations. So the next thing we brought up, what they brought up in the interest of as to what is in the best interest of peace, is they brought up 3 key examples of how the veto power led to the prevention of intervention within these nations where there were actions that were inappropriate taking place. So they brought up 3 examples of Rwanda, Iraq, and Syria, and all of their examples were completely false and completely misconstrued. So in the case of Rwanda, this wasn't actually the case of a veto power. This was actually the case that the United Nations had a regulation that prevented it from interfering in the sovereignty of another nation. This wasn't actually the case of a veto power, and that since that event, this status has changed. We next spoke to this idea of the Iraq War, and how the Iraq War, the Iraq War was somehow caused by a veto power. We would say is that the action of France in vetoing or threatening to veto the Iraq War actually prevented it because it prevented a large number of nations from joining it, and thereby actually prevented a full-fledged war coming out of that. The third idea was this idea of Syria, and the fact that there's a Russia and China preventing the intervention in Syria. We actually don't think it's that simple, because Syria's population is Syria is actually a much denser nation, and it is much smaller. So what we would say is that there's actually no location that's actually held by the rebels right now, and as a result, they can't actually force troops into Syria without taking place a huge effort. And this is not entirely because of the veto. So.
Please, sir.
I'll take you in one moment. The third thing I would like to bring up is this idea of whether or not nations deserve the veto power that they have. But first, I'll take the POI.
Tell us one more place in which the Big Five have represented the interest of a small nation other than the interest of, I don't know, Israel, or in Syria the interest of the dictator Bashar al-Assad, or I don't know, any other good example?
Sorry, I don't entirely understand the question, but I don't really have time to clarify. Okay. So I'd like to move on to my third point about whether or not nations deserve this veto power. What we actually pushed on them was a burden of whether or not they would be able to prove that these nations did not deserve this veto power. So the first thing we said is that these nations have earned this veto power as a result of the historical and modern day contributions. We would say is that these nations have a greater stake. They said that all nations should be equal, and we fundamentally disagree with them, because these nations are the primary military contributors to the United Nations, and the primary contributors of financial aid to the United Nations. They should have a greater say as to where their money goes and where their troops go. And so the next thing on this is whether or not they brought up this idea of whether or not we're going for peace with this. What we would say is that, and they brought up this idea that we should eliminate the veto power and let the permanent five act as a check and balance. But they never really explained how the permanent five act as a check and balance. They simply stated that as a foolish insertion. Then they spoke to the fact that we could start a bunch of wars in the interest of peace, which seems to directly contradict itself. Then they brought up the idea that we could potentially invade North Korea. We would say that North Korea is a nuclear power nation, thereby it's not actually realistic to invade this because it could potentially be extremely violent. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We beg to oppose.
Thank you very much. We'll now hear the opposition reply.
Good evening again, ladies and gentlemen. As the leader of the opposition, it is my duty and pleasure to deliver to you exactly what this debate has come down to. I'd like to thank everyone in the room for their attention thus far, and specifically side proposition for their remarks in today's debate. This House believes that no nations in the UN Security Council should have the right of veto. Side proposition has failed to prove their burden that every single nation, as intended by the resolution, have the right to veto power taken away, such as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and that the 5 veto nations do not all deserve the right to veto. Proposition never answered the deputy opposition question as to why all veto nations deserve to lose their powers due to the actions of some ladies and gentlemen. Yet what have we seen from side oppositions? We've seen an opposition that has been tactical and has had the interests of the United Nations as a whole at heart. So what I'm going to do for you today is categorize this final reply by opposition into 3 principal themes, those being representation, equality, and self-interest, ladies and gentlemen. Now, without further ado, to get into this first major point of clash that we saw today between opposition and proposition. That being that proposition claimed that tyranny of the majority was not an issue in today's debate. And what we would say is that minority will not actually be represented in their proposed majority system, ladies and gentlemen. The voices of a maximum of 7 nations will not be heard. And their response, forgive my vocabulary, ladies and gentlemen, was but for these 7 nations to suck it up and deal with it. But what we would say on opposition is that this is not fair, because these are 7 nations that are no longer united with the rest of the decision of the other nations, and we feel that this is actually an example in which the tyranny of the majority is actually in effect, ladies and gentlemen. Now, they also claim that the permanent 5 nations are looking after their self-interest. And what we would say is that while Britain, France, the United States, and China are actually looking after their self-interest, the reason that they were actually chosen in the first place to be part of this United Nations Security Council is because they also have the interests of the United Nations as a whole and the international community as a whole as interest to them, ladies and gentlemen. And we feel that these 5 nations should actually still be part of that 5 that has the right to veto, ladies and gentlemen, because they're also looking after the interests of the rest of the United Nations. Now, this next point, that they never actually address the effects of a bill fully on the minority, as I talked about a little bit before. They told you that this system, proposed the majority system, would actually be more democratic. Yet they conceded that there may be a majority claim and a majority abuse within their system. And what we would say is that this is actually a less democratic system. We've seen that the tyranny of the majority is extremely prevalent in many democratic systems today, such as nations such as Zimbabwe and Albania. And what we would say is that this is something that as an international community and something that the United Nations themselves, ladies and gentlemen, is actually trying to fix. So we would say that implementing this majority system in which there's a possibility for there to be tyranny of the majority within the United Nations is actually quite ironic, ladies and gentlemen, because it does not uphold the basic values of the United Nations. And we feel that the veto system is actually more democratic in this circumstance, ladies and gentlemen. Now, they also had this idea of all nations should be equal, and that all nations should have an equal voice when dealing with issues of security. But what we would say to this is that all nations should not actually be equal when dealing with issues of security. We feel here on side opposition that Uzbekistan should not have as large as a voice as the United States of America. And that's simply because of the presence of these 5 nations politically and militarily and economically on the world stage, ladies and gentlemen. We feel that smaller nations such as Belize or Uzbekistan should not actually have that much of a presence. And we feel that these 5 nations are actually looking after the best interests, as I stated before, of the United Nations and its member states as a whole. So for ladies and gentlemen, the reasons that I have brought forth to you today, as the leader of the opposition, the deputy opposition, and the opposition whip has brought forth to you today, I would like to thank you very much for your time. It's been a long debate thus far. We are truly proud to oppose the motion before the House.
The proposition reply.
Quote from Op 2. There's no reason for any country to impose an opinion. This is what they sustain, and goes against their own case and their own principles. And this is what I'm going to explain in my reply. But first of all, let's look at what we wanted to hear from team opposition today. First of all, counterexamples of how interventions from the United Nations Security Council worked and how it went to a better status quo today. Second of all, rebuttal to our arguments because they didn't bring that forward. Third of all, a coherent stance because they changed their stance from the first speaker to the second to the third. Now, also, we wanted to know exactly how tyranny of the majority, as we challenge them to prove, does not exist in their world when you can not place a veto and you still decide things in the United Security Council through a majority of votes. That is a fact. Now, we believe that they don't clearly understand how the United Nations Security Council works. So let's clarify this for the end. First of all, there is no such thing as a UN army. There is such a thing as United Nations peacekeeping troops, where all countries voluntarily send people, and I want to emphasize that all countries send people. To their logic, they said that because this country send more people than others, but also everyone sends, they should have veto power. We don't believe that is true. My colleague showed you how exactly that's factually incorrect. So also, let's go to my first point about living in the world of the shadow of veto. First of all, let's see exactly what the excuse for veto was, even for team opposition. First of all, that they deserve it, historically and because they contribute. Now, first of all, we see that we don't really care about what happened in history in World War II, in World War I, so on. We care about the fact that the United Nations wants world peace. This is their goal, and the only way to achieve it is exactly by equality for all countries in order to balance each other on the international stage, in order not for one to have more power over the others, as we see that the United States is doing, as we see that Russia is doing by exactly imposing their will upon the rest of the world. Also, we believe that they also said that we protect the interests of small countries. First of all, that is the purpose of the rotating 10 countries in the United Nations Security Council. Second of all, we see that yes, we protect interests. We protect the interests of Bashar al-Assad that kills people in Syria. Russia does that. We don't agree that this is something good. They did not answer to that. Second of all, they protect Israel against Palestine. They protect the interests of an ongoing war. We believe that this is not the purpose of the United Nations Security Council. They did not answer to that. Now, we believe that in Rwanda they lost sovereignty when exactly the government went against their people. And they did not answer to that. They did not answer to the fact that so millions of people die in the world while the United Nations Security Council, United Nations as a whole, is in a standlock. Now, also, we see exactly that we create this polarized world. We create the world of veto power. Now, veto power, we believe that should be taken from all countries because the mere existence of this principle in the United Nations Security Council is the thing that polarizes the world into the permanent 5 members. Now, this power, this perpetuating of power, the argument that the opposition team did not answer to, is exactly that makes the minority be stepped on by this permanent 5 because they have the power. Now, in the end, I want the second point about a leap for peace is exactly the future of the United Nations that we want today and that team opposition do not prove they bring. First of all is the fact that we have more consensus. More equality makes taking decisions faster, makes intervening and saving people faster, which makes the United Nations more viable. Also, we brought you the fact that you have equality in decision-making, which leads to more peace and more stability in the world because you have this balance of powers on the international stage. At the end of the day, we thank you for being here, and we beg you to vote for proposition at the end of this tournament.
Thank you very much. I think that we might technically be allowed to give comments, but I think most rooms aren't giving any comments. It's very hard to give useful comments.
Yeah.
We can't reveal the result.
And anyway, we can come to you for feedback after.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Congratulations. Congratulations. And good job.